You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. Ever wondered what keeps us locked in people-pleasing and how we can break free? Tune in today to learn more. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we explore the reasons behind people-pleasing and why so many of us struggle to break free from it. We discuss how the drive to keep others happy can lead to overwhelm and stress, especially if we're juggling a busy career and home life. Meet Michelle Gauthier, the life coach who turns chaos into calm. She helps busy, overwhelmed women find peace and efficiency. She's the host of the Overwhelmed Working Woman podcast. Michelle is a single mom to 2 adopted kids. She left a 20-year corporate career in 2017 to become a life coach. Since then, she's guided hundreds of women to balance careers and home life with ease. When not coaching, Michelle enjoys cheering at her kids' sports events, working out, organizing for fun, online shopping, and reading self-improvement books. Here is my interview with Michelle Gauthier. Hi, Michelle. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because why women can't stop people pleasing is such a fantastic topic for our chat today. And I have a feeling that there are quite a few listeners who can identify with that and are very curious about that as well. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure. I feel like we're going to be talking about something very important because a lot of us do it, but we don't know why. So amazing, amazing topic. Now, for starters, would you like to share a little bit about yourself and maybe give the listeners a bit of an insight of what you do and your personal journey, how that brought you to what you do today and how that all connects together?
Yes. And that will easily connect to people pleasing as well, because I was a superstar people pleaser. So I grew up basically, I'm the oldest child. I always liked getting recognized for getting good grades, and I wanted to get straight A's and be a leader at school and all those things. And I think I just learned early in my life that when I did the right things, that it felt good because I would get the kind of attention that I wanted. And so when I went off to college and then graduate school and then got a job, I just continued that same behavior because that always seemed to work for me. And by the time that I was married, I had 2 kids. We adopted 2 kids from Texas here in the US. And I kind of had everything I ever wanted, meaning if I would have created a vision board when I was like 20, I could have checked everything off the list, but something inside me just felt like, this is it. This isn't, and it wasn't that I was not appreciative of my kids or my situation, but something was just really missing, and it was something big. And I think for me, it was the fact that I was just constantly running, focused on what other people wanted me to do, working so hard. The only thing I knew to do when I would feel overwhelmed was just to work more. And so I just kept working more, and I'd put my kids to bed and go back to work until midnight. And I just felt really dissatisfied, even though in theory I had everything that I ever wanted.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And it's one of those things when you come to that point and you wonder what happened or what is going on that I am not feeling that satisfaction. So, yeah,
Yes,
thank you for sharing
exactly.
that.
And it was like I recognized that I had a problem, but I had no idea how to solve it. And so now I always tell people, even if you don't know what you want, instead, come and talk to me. Like, trust that inner intuition that something is off. So I started investigating it for myself. And it was kind of funny because I was listening to a podcast one night and the guest was a life coach. And I had this moment where I was like, that's it. That's what I want to do. I felt this nudge to be in service to people. I had a corporate job and I did really well, but I wasn't like helping anyone. I mean, obviously, if you have a job, you're helping some people, but you know what I mean? I wasn't coaching people or really truly in service to anyone. And so I signed up to do training to become a life coach like within 24 hours. And it was $7,000. It wasn't like a little $30 investment or something. I just knew that this was the path that I should take. But when I went into it, I was thinking, I'm going to be so good at being a life coach. And once I started the training, I realized I'm the person who, number one, needs a life coach. So it was very interesting that way. So before I completed the training, but before I actually started doing that as my job, I went through lots of life coaching myself. I went to therapy. I called it my mental health activity of the day. So I would do yoga. Oh, what's that kind of yoga where you hold the pose for a really long time? I don't know. I would always cry during yoga. It must release something in you. So I did yoga, I did meditation, I did prayer, therapy, life coaching, anything you can imagine, journaling. And because I was just determined to like get to the bottom of what was going on with me. And eventually I just started living my life in a new way. I got separated and eventually got divorced. I quit my corporate job and started doing life coaching full time. And I've been doing that since about 2018.
Wow, there was a lot going on by the sounds of it once you kind of figured out where you wanted to go with things. So,
Yes.
wow.
Yes.
Yeah. And sometimes it does take just those pivots in life and those changes to get us in the direction that we actually feel aligned with. So, good on you for making those changes and taking eventually those inner cues and following up on them. Yeah.
Yes. And sometimes I was making those changes, and sometimes those changes made me, right? Like it was all of a sudden like, okay, I'm not going to be married anymore. All right, we'll see how to deal with this. So it was a combination of things happening to me and things that I was making happen. And I just kept going and I just kept putting my mental health at the forefront, which for me at that time, because I had two little kids and I was on my own, it really required me getting up at like 5 a.m. so that I could have, at that time, I would do it for an hour and a half. Now it's much shorter because I've done so much work that I can journal for, 10 or 15 minutes and feel pretty good about my day.
Oh, you touch on something really interesting here. And I just want to ask you because a lot of people are almost afraid to look inside or to look at what's happening because they fear that the changes that will be necessary are going to completely upend their life, maybe end their marriage or get them kind of taken away from their job. And so a lot of people are actually really scared to look because they don't want to face those huge changes. So is that necessarily something that happens in your experience when we start looking inside? Is it generally very drastic, or can we do that also in sort of bite-sized steps that align us more with what we want to
Yes.
be doing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I always say to people who want to know my story, like if someone's considering working with me and I think they want to know, like, well, how do you know about this? And I always say, I don't recommend the approach that I took or life took and I reacted to, where you like quit your job, get divorced, move houses, got a puppy in there too. Like that is just way too much too soon. So I actually wouldn't recommend the approach that I took. What I would do is start off like when I started, I wish I would have told someone when I started having those feelings of dissatisfaction, maybe 1 or 2 years before. I wish I would have talked to a therapist or a coach or even gotten some like journaling guidance about what to write about. Because I think even envisioning or taking the time to just admit to the things that you don't like about what your life has right now is a really good first step. And I think if you're like most people who I work with, they, instead of pausing and looking inside themselves, they just work more because that helps you avoid those thoughts, or they drink more, or they shop more, or, just do things that I would call buffers to avoid looking inside. And I promise you, it's not as scary as you think that it is in there.
Yeah, I agree. It can be quite the journey, but there's always a point where you can start and you can do what feels safe for you, what feels good for you, and follow that. So,
Yes.
what happens, Michelle, when you start looking inside and you realize that you're unhappy and you want to make changes, and you're the person actively working on that and maybe realigning yourself, but your partner or spouse is not? Is there possibly a disconnect as you kind of start growing and you start aligning more with your purpose and you feel like the other person is not really growing with you? They're kind of staying where they were before. They're maybe stagnant or stuck. So how did that, I mean, you ended a relationship or you left a relationship. So is there a disconnect between what happens sometimes when we do start this journey?
Yeah. So I've basically seen one of three things happen in that situation because almost everyone I coach is married or has a partner. So usually it's either one person really works on improving their life. When they work with me, and I'm sure you're the same, we only focus on that one person because that's in their control, right? So we're not going to try to change the spouse. We're just going to try to change the person who's working with me and make those choices. So what happens most often is when that person starts to change, so does their partner without anything happening. It's like they see the way that their partner is feeling and they think, I want to be like that. I want to feel more like that. Or I work with my client to accept the person as they are and work on those thoughts of, okay, so maybe this person really isn't into self reflection or meditation or yoga or any of this woo woo stuff that I'm into. Do I still love them? And if so, then I'm just going to lean into that. It's essentially just focusing on not trying to change them, but loving them as is. Or you might create a boundary and say, I cannot live my life with a person who is not in support of this. And sometimes people make that choice, but that is the smallest percentage. What happens the most is the first thing I said, which is that when one person improves themselves, and often the people who I work with are the mom in the family. I work with men too, but mostly women. And so when it's the mom, the whole family starts feeling better.
Yeah, it kind of has that effect, I guess, when we are aligning and we actually start experiencing joy and happiness in what we
Yes.
do, kind of ripples into the family. I feel like we show up differently at that point as well. So I can definitely see how that.
Yeah, exactly. When you start showing up much more calm and
Yeah.
when you're much more present, and when things that used to make you just flip your lid, all of a sudden you're like, oh, that happened. It's not that big of a deal because you're not living on the edge of freaking out all the time. The whole family feels it. Like mornings getting ready to get everybody out the door feel completely differently than they felt before.
Yeah. So would you say that the people pleasing and as you described, that was also something that you did. Is people pleasing a bit of a coping mechanism then, or a way to not have to look inside? Or how would you kind of describe
Yeah.
what happens when you're people pleasing?
Yeah, I think the way that I would describe people pleasing or define people pleasing is that we are choosing what to do based on what we think the other person wants for us. So it's like when you're choosing someone else over yourself, often to the detriment of yourself. So, for example, at work, if you're kind of that go to person, and if anything needs to be done that's above and beyond, it always comes to you. And you're saying yes because you want to, for example, make your boss like you or be happy with you, but it's to your own detriment because now you just have more to do and you'll be staying at work later, or you won't be able to focus at home because you're thinking that you've got to do this extra thing. So it's really about trying to please other people or make other people like us, but to the detriment of ourselves.
Yeah. So are we answering the question of why we people please here then? Is it to kind of stay out of conflict? Because I think that's what we're all curious about. Why do we continue doing it when very often it is clearly to the detriment of ourselves, our physical
Yeah.
and mental health, even? So is it a protective thing? Is it a wanting to avoid conflict? Or in your experience when you were people pleasing, why is that something that continued?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. I mean, I think in general, at least I would say this in the US. So you tell me if this is true in Germany and France, but we as women are socialized to put other people first. And I think a lot of our value as women comes from us being caretakers. And, that saying of like, oh, she's the best mom. She's so selfless. Like the idea of us not having a self is considered to be good sometimes. I no longer think that, but I feel like that's sort of the societal piece of it. And then I think there's the feedback that we get from doing that. So when you're the person who takes on every extra work project, for example, you get a lot of likes. You know how we like social media likes? You get a lot of likes when you're the go-to person who's really reliable. And so that feels good. So I think we become sort of addicted to that, to the idea of being the star and that people like us and they can count on us. So I think that's kind of where it comes from, those two things. And even though we might know at some level, I didn't actually realize that this wasn't good for me or that I was doing this at all. But if you have gotten to the point, you, the listener, have gotten to the point where you realize, I think I'm saying yes a lot for in times that are really not good for me. First of all, great job, because noticing and listening to yourself, disagree with yourself is a really important part of it. But I think that we sometimes still continue to do things that aren't good for us, even when we know they aren't good for us, just because it's familiar. And familiar doesn't necessarily mean good. It's like we keep going back to what is familiar and not taking the steps it takes to do things that feel really, what I would say is like clean. Like I'm taking care of myself. I'm saying what I really mean. I'm being authentic. I'm in alignment with what I really mean.
Yeah, there's a sense of safety in what we know and what is familiar to us. So it's easier to go back to that than to kind of leave that zone of comfort many times. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think your point about us people pleasing to stay safe, it's really easy to kind of stay under the radar of conflict if you're just always saying yes.
Yeah, that's true. And, I just want to point out here that I think very often when we do people please, there is a little voice inside that goes off. It gives us maybe just a little twinge and something feels a bit off when we're saying yes to things that we don't really want to do, or we're agreeing to things that we don't really want to take on, or we might not have the energy to take on, and we say yes anyways. A lot of the times I noticed that there was a little twinge inside, but I just ignored it because it was
Yep.
easier that way. But that was there, and it would give me just a little pinch in my stomach, and I would notice and think to myself, oh, okay, but I'm going to do it anyways because, like you said, people are going to be much happier. I can avoid conflict with that. I'll just show up and I'll do my part that's expected. But there was that little twinge. So I think
Yes.
if we could start listening to that and start trusting that a little bit more, even though that can be very scary, I think that will start pointing into the direction that we actually would like to go, and in a direction that might be mentally, emotionally, physically more beneficial for us. So, yeah, it does
Absolutely.
happen. But for some people, that voice is so buried that it doesn't come out very
Yes.
often. But sometimes that gives you that twinge.
Yes, but it's kind of like we were talking about at the beginning, where somebody realizes that they want something isn't right in their life and they want to make a change. And you hear that little voice. This is kind of the same thing. Like you heard that little voice or got that little feeling, particularly you said it was in your stomach. So if you can start noticing those kinds of things, that's the first step. So I would say, even when that's all you were doing, let's say you felt that thing in your stomach, you said yes anyway, and you kind of knew that something was off. That's one big step in the direction of getting towards not people pleasing.
Yeah, and it can be scary and hard to follow that. So I definitely am humbled every time that people take that step or they set just even a small little boundary, because I understand
Yes.
how difficult that is. So,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the other thing to talk about before we get to my suggestions on how to stop people pleasing is that a lot of times, if you ask people, why are you doing this? Their answer is like, well, I want to be nice, or I'm seen as a nice person. I feel like nice is a word that's used a lot. around people pleasing. But when you keep asking why and you get to the bottom of it, people pleasing isn't nice. It's actually, I would even say, like, I don't want to say the word manipulative, but something in that direction, because what you're trying to do is control how other people feel about you. So I'm saying yes to you because I want you to think, oh, Michelle's so nice. Michelle's so helpful. And so really, I'm doing it for me because I want that feeling of thinking that you think I'm nice. Now, of course, we know I can never control what you think, and I have no idea what you're thinking. Like, you might already not like me no matter what I do. I can't I have no control over that. So I think that's a really important thing to remember too, because people stick with people pleasing to say, well, I'm nice and I'm doing good things for other people, but really you're just trying to make yourself feel better. And that's okay. Like, you don't have to hate on yourself for that. It's just a pattern, and it's a pattern that you learned based on how you behave and how other people behaved back towards you. But I found it easier to quit people pleasing when I thought about it that way. Like, I'm just trying to make myself feel better. And I think I'll actually feel better instead of thinking you might like me, is to like the choices that I'm making for myself.
Yeah, that's a good point. And to add to that, I also feel like people pleasing can be a learned stress response for some people if they have found that they may suffer abuse if they disagree or some sort of violence. There may be a learned pattern, like you said, that just saying yes or just agreeing keeps them safe in some sense. And so I think it could also be a stress response that we learn from these
Absolutely.
previous patterns. And that's how we cope when something becomes overwhelming or we come to that point of conflict. So that's a really good thing to become aware of. And like you said, once we become aware of that, we actually can make the changes that we need to move forward from that. Now, I'm curious, when you start looking inside and you start becoming aware and you start noting that there are things that aren't quite aligned and you move on that and you change on that, does the people pleasing actually resolve on its own as you learn to set boundaries and listen to yourself? Or is this still something that we need to be actively working on as we progress?
I would say actively working on, because I just noticed myself doing it. I've been doing this work for like 6 years, and I just noticed myself doing it the other day. And I just laughed to myself. And I think there are certain situations or people, like, for example, I'm very, very focused on my parents being happy with me. So those would be the hardest people for me to say no to, because it's my parents and I want them to think I'm doing a good job. It doesn't matter how old I get. And so I still can notice myself going into those patterns. And the way that I think about that is, if you think about it like driving on a road, interacting with my parents is the road that I've driven the most on. The pattern is so, so deep, where in a work situation, I don't think I would ever people please or say yes when I didn't want to. Like, I just don't do that anymore. But some of those really old patterns, it's still, I have to catch myself along the way. I do think, though, doing any kind of self exploratory work helps in the direction of people pleasing, getting less and less, and learning how to say no and all of those things. But I still think we have to work on it. I'm not sure that we ever get to that final, I'm so evolved state. I think we just continue to work on it. And as certain things fall away, maybe other things creep up. I've thought so many times, I thought I was done with the self work. It's never over, is what I've learned.
Doesn't work that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But I suspect you're probably the same way, because I think we're similar, but I also love continuously reading self-help books. Like, there's always more to learn. And so that's how I try to frame it. There's always more to learn about myself. There's always more to learn about my old patterns and new things that I want to create. But yeah, to answer your question, I do think that people pleasing is something that might require just continued work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. There's always more to learn. So tell us a little bit about your suggestions on And what can people and women, maybe in particular, do to stop people pleasing? What are some of the suggestions we can take on, some of the steps we can follow, or some of the things we can start or stop doing to kind of work around the people pleasing if that's a pattern that we've sort of been raised with or that's so ingrained? How do we stop that?
So the first thing is what you've already alluded to, which is noticing that you're doing it and noticing that it isn't working in your life. And I think when you do that, you'll start having awareness of it if you've never had awareness before. And suddenly you'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm doing this all the time to all the people. And so when you get to that step, I want you to not judge yourself and remember that thoughts come into your mind, patterns have been worked over your whole entire life, and try to just look at it as a neutral, like you're observing it like a scientist. Oh, I see. I see what my brain is doing there. My first response is to say yes in order to keep myself safe or whatever it is. So the first thing is being able to pause and notice that you're about to people please, even if you still do it. Just noticing is a real move in the right direction. And then the next thing that I do, if you can buy yourself some time, so usually people pleasing is someone asking something and you're saying yes or no to them. So if you can buy yourself some time, especially at first, so that you can learn how to do these steps in your mind quickly. But if you can say, thanks for asking, I'll get back to you tomorrow or something like that. A lot of times we put pressure on ourselves that we need to respond right away, but we don't. The ball's in our court at that point. So buy yourself a little time. And then I use this method that I came up with called the love and fit test, where you ask yourself two questions. One is, do I absolutely love this idea? So in that example I was talking about with the work thing, I don't absolutely love the idea of taking on an extra project. Or maybe I do. Maybe it's something really cool that I'm passionate about and I do love it. But then the fit test is, does this fit not in my calendar, but does this fit into the type of lifestyle that I'm trying to create for myself? So, in my example, if I think back to myself being that corporate person who was getting asked to do the extra things, the type of life that I started trying to create for myself was one where I had more balance and I worked less and I felt good and I could look at my to-do list and actually accomplish it in the day instead of having 27 things I didn't get to. So that would have been a really solid no for me. So even if I loved the idea, it did not fit in the type of life that I was trying to create for myself. And then the last magical step is actually saying no. So if you get to the no, and maybe in that love and fit test example I gave, maybe it's a yes, and you say yes, and all is good and in alignment in the world. But if you have to say no based on those answers, what I really encourage people to do is just say no. I did a whole podcast episode on like 25 ways to say no, but the easiest way to do it is just to say no or no, thank you, and then just stop. I think as women, because this is people pleasing, we feel like we have to explain. I totally would do that, but I'm working on this other big project and I just don't think I'd have the time to do it. And we just go into all of these and just say, nope, I don't have time for that. Or no, thanks. I don't have space in my schedule. Or nope, my life coach said I can't take on anything more. Or, whatever it is, just say no and then leave it at that. And you will feel totally uncomfortable in that moment as you sit and wait for the response of the other person, but just sit through it. You can do it and just say no. And that can be the end.
Thank you so much for sharing those. And I'm smiling because, yeah, there's this point where I feel like I need to justify when I say no and offer up this whole explanation of why I can't do it. So thank you for pointing that out, that I don't actually need to do that. I could just say no.
You don't. You don't. And it's funny because I have a few friends who I can think of who are people who absolutely say no when they don't want to do something. And when I think about them, I think, do you have any friends like that who are just like straightforward and will say no?
Oh, yeah.
And like, what are your thoughts about them? Do you think, oh, I don't like them because they always say no?
Yeah, we just move on. Right?
Yeah,
We
exactly.
respect that and accept it and we move on.
Exactly. Like those are the friends A friend just recently invited me to something really last minute. Like it was that afternoon. And she said, I have this extra ticket. Let me know if you want to go. And then she wrote back, P.S. It's such a relief that I don't have to say to you, if you don't want to go, it's no problem. Like felt like she didn't have to let me off the hook. Cause if I didn't want to go or couldn't go, I would just say, oh, thanks for thinking of me. Can't do it today or doesn't fit into my schedule or whatever. And I just think when I interact with people like that, it's such a relief because, if they say yes, they really want to be there. And if they say no, that they don't. And it's so simple and straightforward. So I encourage people to think about that too, because we feel like if we say no, people aren't going to like us. But if you think about people in your life who are straightforward like that, I feel like it's overwhelmingly positively seen.
It's very authentic. And I feel like it saves a bit of back and forth on having to offer up excuses or explanations. And you just know you can trust that person's answer. And that's okay. It's respectful. You move on.
Yes,
So, yeah, it does make things a
exactly.
lot easier. You're
It
right.
does.
Yeah.
Yes. I feel like this is stereotypical and I'm acknowledging that this is a stereotype, but I had a job where I worked with almost all men. Like most of our meetings would just be men and me. And I noticed that they are so much more like that, or they would just say, no, I don't like that idea. And I was like, oh, and it's honestly really nice to have somebody who will just straight up tell you, like, nope, I don't like that idea. And I think in some ways, women, now I work with plenty of men who are people pleasers too. So this isn't exclusively for women, but stereotypically speaking, I think men are naturally better at this.
Yeah. And I think they take it less personal. I feel like
Yeah.
sometimes when someone says no as women, we may tend to take that very personal, like this is a personal attack on us and who we are. And men tend to just see that as, oh, that's just how it is. That's life, business, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I'm just voicing an opinion. We're moving on. And yeah, as even myself, I sometimes take it personal when someone says just straight up no. So that's a good thing to work on. It's just to
Yeah,
understand
exactly.
that's just life. We don't need to take that personal. We can just leave that with the person that said no, and it's all good, and we can move on.
Yeah. And you said something so good when we were talking about people who say no. You said, yeah, that's just so authentic. So maybe instead of taking it personally, you can say, oh, that person was felt comfortable to be really authentic with me.
Yeah, amazing. It is a type of honesty, right?
It
To be able
is.
to say that to someone straight up, yes, no. So yeah, takes some courage, some bravery, takes that authenticity. So we can maybe practice a little bit with that and
Yes.
see
Yes.
ourselves in that honest space of voicing who we are and what we like or don't like. So yeah, good point.
Yes. I think that's great. And I think one of the biggest things is if you hear this podcast and you want to try some of these things and you try them and you fail miserably, it's okay. Just keep on taking one little step. Take that first step of noticing, take that second step of doing the love and fit test. And even if you end up saying yes when you want to say no, you're still making progress. So I wouldn't put pressure on yourself to take a pattern that you've had for 30 plus years and be able to turn it around based on listening to one podcast. Just slowly, steadily work on it and you'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So a good place to start would also be to work with you if listeners have some challenges with people pleasing or finding their direction or their authentic way. So, how could our listeners work with you? What kind of programs and services do you offer, Michelle?
I offer one on one coaching. I do a 6 month coaching program one on one with clients. And then I also have a group coaching that is a 3 month program. And both of those are focused on helping people who are feeling super overwhelmed and never present anywhere to feeling calm and managing their time well, saying no, stopping people pleasing, all those things that we have been talking about today. And then a free resource I have is my podcast, which is called Overwhelmed Working Woman. I drop a new episode on Monday mornings because that was the time when I always felt most overwhelmed. So I do short episodes and it talks to one specific thing. And then I try to leave you with one tip for the week that you can use to make yourself feel more calm or less overwhelmed.
That sounds amazing. And we, of course, will be linking to all of Michelle's offerings in the show notes as well. So be sure to check there for how you can work with her and also where you can listen to her podcast, The Overwhelmed Working Woman, because that sounds fantastic. Getting a tip on how you can get through the week. That sounds like a
Yes.
really great
Yes.
resource. So I encourage you all to pop over there and have a listen from your favorite podcast provider and check the show notes if you need the links to anything. We'll definitely put that in there. And pop over to Instagram as well and connect with us and let us know how you've enjoyed this episode, how you're enjoying the resources. Did you connect with Michelle or did you end up working with Michelle? We'd love to hear about that and we'd love to hear about your experiences and anything that you'd like to share with us on the podcast. I always feel like there's a lot of magic that happens when our listeners connect with our guests and they have these magical relationships and connections that happen. So, yeah, let us know what your experiences. We'd love to hear from you. And this has been another incredible episode. And I really hope our listeners have enjoyed our journey into people pleasing as much as I have. I feel like I learned so much in this time that we spent together, Michelle. So thank you for coming on today and sharing this knowledge and wisdom that you've built up with our listeners so they can use some of that in their own lives as well. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I love what you're doing too. Your podcast is fantastic and you're putting out so much good knowledge into the world.
Yeah, it's all possible thanks to amazing guests like yourself sharing everything that you have gone through and kind of painstakingly put together so that
Yes,
our audience
right.
can benefit from that. So
The gift of desperation, right? When you feel miserable, you've got to figure something out.
yeah, it's usually the first steps on how we end up on these healing
Yes,
paths, right? So
yes, exactly.
absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thanks for being here today. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and sharing this conversation with Michelle and myself. And take care, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejorni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.